Good morning. My name is Pat Blanchard, and it is my honor and pleasure to interview Max James Copenhagen in conjunction with the Canal Valley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Colonial Dames of the 17th Century for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. This interview is being recorded by Ed Lynch from Advanta Videography and contains collections and memories of the veterans' time in the United States Armed Forces. Today is March 22nd, 2019, and we are in my home in Thousand Oaks, California. Max was born in Seattle, Washington on October 16, 1947, to Herman and Lois Copenhagen. He has two sisters, Diane and Karen. He is married to Donna Searcy, and they have two children, Sam and Lori, and a granddaughter, Alana. Max's father received a job offer from an oil company as an engineer and decided to move his family to California. Max attended Mira Valesta Grammar School, Dapple Gray Middle School, and graduated high school in Fullerton Union in 1965. And this is Max's story.
I'm Max Copenhagen. I was in the USArmy 1970 to 71. I graduated from high school in 1965. While I was at Fullerton Union High School, I do remember an Army helicopter pilot coming in and talking to us at a General Assembly. I don't remember much about what he said, but I do remember that exposure. Other than that, I don't think I knew anything about Vietnam or politics or what was going on in that part of the world. Yet when I went off to UC Berkeley, I remember I was actually 17. I was like 1 month short of my 18th birthday. I actually registered for the draft in Berkeley. I just walked in and registered for the draft because I knew I needed to do that. Nobody forced me. My parents hadn't said anything about it. It was just understood that I would do that. And so I remember doing that, and after a year or two at Berkeley, I guess it was about 1966, I realized I needed to come up with a plan or I would be drafted as soon as I graduated. So I decided to join ROTC, and that was a story. That was really quite interesting. I was a pretty good student in forestry. And I was a pretty good student in what they call military history. And that was all interesting and good. The problem was the drill. Walking across the campus of UC Berkeley in 1967 through 69 in a military uniform kind of draws a crowd. So I decided to take early drill at 7 o'clock in the morning. Which a lot of us did. So we would go out and parade around on the football field and take care of our drill that way, and that avoided a lot of conflict. So I don't remember having any issue other than I think somebody threw a wadded up piece of paper at me once as I was walking across campus. So part of the ROTC program and a large part of the hands-on training occurs at a summer camp that I went to in the summer. It was about 6 or 8 weeks the summer of '68 up in Fort Lewis, Washington. So I went up there, and they treated us like basic trainees. You know, it was kind of rough. You know, they cut my hair, which was shocking. In fact, the most shocking part of it was when you freshly have your hair cut, it's kind of bristly, and it makes a noise on the pillow when you're trying to sleep. So it's just kind of weird having that haircut. But I remembered we had to pay for the haircut. I think it cost 50 cents. We had to thank the barber and give him 50 cents. And it was weird, but we all had to do it. So they ran us, they drilled us and gave us all the small arms training, and we did all these things. I didn't mind it. I think I'm not the most disciplined person in the world. I try to be obedient. I I don't like polishing my brass and things like that, but I did enjoy the map work and the land navigation, the night navigation courses, things like that. So it was okay. After the 6 or 8 weeks, we were out, and I had the rest of my summer. I actually went and got a forestry job. I had a forestry job lined up, which I was able to go back to for the rest of the summer. So that was my basic training, and then I had basic officers course in El Paso. I did get commissioned when I graduated in June '69. I was fortunate then. They offered new officers the option of when they wanted to go in. So I didn't know where I was going to go, but I did know that I could select to actually defer my active duty for up to a year, which I did. So I traveled the world for a year, and I went around the Mediterranean and the Middle East and just saw a lot of the world. And then in about June of 1970, I was back and I reported for duty at Fort Bliss, Texas, to basic officers training for air defense artillery. And while there, I learned how to fire Nike Hercules missiles, anti-aircraft missiles. And after a couple of months there, in the heat of El Paso, I was miraculously ordered to go to Alaska. So I had a great experience driving up to Alaska. I mean, I just thought I was being sent to heaven. You know, this just seemed like a great deal. I had a full-time job, room and board essentially taken care of. I had a car, and I drove up to Alaska, and I thought this was going to be great. You know, I was lucking out. I got to Alaska in September of '70, and I was assigned to a fire base. It was a company that was prepared to fire Nike Hercules missiles at formations of Russian aircraft coming into the United States, into North America. So these are very, very powerful, very fast missiles, and we would go. So I was assigned to. There were two platoons. There was the fire control platoon that operated the electronics and actually pushed the button that fired the missile. And then there was the missile preparation platoon that worked on the missile and getting it ready to be fired. So they had to arm it, they had to bring it up. I think it might have been underground. I think it was underground, and they brought it up into a firing position. But I was platoon leader of the fire control platoon, where we every day we would go through exercises and training or practice or inspections to calibrate the instruments, calibrate them to the radar, and just test different links and go through a scenario of almost firing the missile. There were a lot of codes involved. We had to authenticate the codes in order to set certain of the explosive devices. And I would be there all night, and you know, I didn't actually live at the battery. I lived at Fort Richardson, which is just north of Anchorage, but I would be there on a 24-hour shift, essentially. And sometimes we'd get woken up in the middle of the night in order to do a drill, or because somebody thought something was going to happen. It didn't matter why, but you had to virtually sleep with your boots on. I was surprised. You had to pop up and go downstairs in this case and be ready to fire a missile within 10 or 15 minutes. I really, I think one thing I enjoyed about the Army was I got to meet some real people. I guess I had a sheltered life. I grew up in Orange County. I went to university. But in the Army, I was meeting some real people, and I was supervising some real people too. I had to give performance evaluations to some people that I thought, I thought they were just terrible employees, but I realized that they were career Army, and if I gave them a bad performance rating, it would ruin their career. It would really hurt them. So I had to be sensitive to that. I had to be empathetic to that. One of these guys working for me, he didn't show up one day to work, and we had to go to his house and knock on his door and get him out of bed because he'd been drunk the night before. Things like that. So, there were some real people. I remember one guy worked for me. I'd never met somebody from Louisiana. He not only came from Louisiana, but he was just such an average guy, and we'd talk, and his ambition was, he had worked in a hardware store when he joined the Army. His ambition was to go back and work in that hardware store and become an expert at mixing paint. That was his ambition, but it was a nice, it wasn't my ambition. It didn't seem like much of an ambition to me, but he was a nice guy, very wholesome, and I enjoyed talking to him. So the Army put me in contact with a lot of real people. We're going to talk about the Anchorage airport. One of the interesting little expectations or assignments or tasks having to do with the Nike Hercules is that because the mission was to stop formations of aircraft from entering North America, part of that was in case if that wasn't able to happen before these aircraft got to Anchorage, we didn't want any enemy aircraft landing in Anchorage. And there's a very large international airport south of Anchorage. So one of our missions was to actually set the missile on surface to surface and have it go up in the air and come down and ruin Anchorage Airport. We didn't expect that to happen, but we had to be ready to set the missile to do that, and the missile didn't do that easily. Basically, you had to go through a long set of calculations involving logarithms. This is 1970, before the calculator. So in order to get through this worksheet, and I remember this worksheet, it was like 14 inches long, it was like a legal document. In order to get through this worksheet, you had to put in all this information like distance, things you could get off a map, and then using trigonometry and logarithms, come up with the settings that would be entered by hand into the fire control equipment to override any radar information you had, because this is a point on the ground. But I just remember, these were hairy calculations. I got them right. I know I went through a few inspections and got them right, but you could make a mistake with we were having to look up logarithms in books that Captain Cook or Captain Vancouver might have used 200 years ago. This was basic math, but it was kind of a primitive form of calculation, in my opinion. And it's sort of scary and shocking that we had to do this, or might have been needed to do this type of calculation in order to do that mission. So I guess I give it as an example of not only that this was kind of sketchy and nervous, but it also, I think you needed the math background that I had in order to do that job. it wasn't something that just anybody could do. You had to be comfortable looking up these logarithms and doing that kind of calculation. So I was up in Alaska for about 10 months when my entire basic officers course of about 40 new second lieutenants were ordered to Vietnam. And it just didn't make any sense to me. I tried to explain to them that it didn't make any sense because I had really less than a year left on my commitment, but they did it anyway. They sent us to Vietnam. So that would have been the summer of '71. It was about the end of June of '71. I reported again to Travis Air Force Base in Northern California, and we were flown over to Vietnam. We landed in Bien Hoa. One thing I remember about that flight is it was a charter flight with one of the airlines, and the stewardesses on the airplane were older than my mother. I mean, they were like, I didn't know there were such senior citizen stewardesses in the airline business, but because they were getting combat pay, they were able to get this assignment through their seniority, so they wanted it. And then when I was told that I was being reassigned from Alaska to Vietnam, all I knew was that my first stop would be Fort Benning, Georgia, where all officers, I guess everybody going to Vietnam had to go through an advanced infantry training there. So we ran around Fort Benning and did things in the woods there, and that was interesting. I'd never been to the South before. It was only 3 weeks, but I had that advanced infantry training in Fort Benning, Georgia. So we're in Vietnam. I landed in Vietnam in Bien Hoa. Unfortunately, I never got to Saigon. I know Bien Hoa Air Force Base is very close to Saigon, but they sent us directly up to Da Nang. All I remember of Bien Hoa was that they had us all brush our teeth with some special fluoride toothpaste. And I can still taste it, and I just thought that was really weird. They thought that was so important, but they lined us all up and they made us brush our teeth like that. And so then within a day we were sent off to our units, and I was assigned to the 101st Airborne, which was north of Da Nang. It was in a camp called Camp Eagle. The Vietnamese name for that place is Phu Bai, and it's just within a few miles of Hue, the traditional capital of Vietnam. And there had already been an awful lot of battles around Hue, so there wasn't much to see. But I do remember driving through Hue and going up to Phu Bai. Phu Bai wasn't pretty. I don't think there was a living green plant on that whole hilltop. It was a hilltop, and I think Phu Bai meant cemetery. So it wasn't a nice place. It was very dusty, very brown. I don't know if they intentionally killed all the plants, but it was just an ugly place. It was a big camp, essentially, for the headquarters and all the logistical supply operations of the 101st Airborne. There were fire bases around Phu Bai on all the hilltops. There was trucks going in and out. And my job, I was assigned to Division Support Command, which dispatched helicopters and trucks, known as deuce and a half, heavy diesel trucks, to deliver supplies and ammunition to all these fire bases and the units that were outside the perimeter of Camp Eagle.
What kind of training did you get while you were in Vietnam?
I did get 1 day of training as soon as we got to Camp Eagle, and the Army had learned this. They needed to give you this special training, so I was willing. I remember they showed us two things. They showed us a Vietnamese. They had introduced him as Viet Cong, who had converted and come over to the Army of Vietnam side, and so he was a demonstrator. He demonstrated how they would sneak under a barbed wire fence, and he scared the heck out of us because he just kind of came out of nowhere, started sliding, and got under all this barbed wire while he was carrying a bomb. He had this satchel on his side that could have been full of dynamite, and he just slowly slid under all that barbed wire and came right into our perimeter. So we saw that demonstration, and then we all had to rappel because this is the 101st Airborne, and I was not jump qualified because I was ADA, Air Defense Artillery, but they wanted us all to know how to get out of a helicopter on a rope if we had to. Basically, that's how they were doing it there. They weren't jumping with parachutes much in Vietnam then, but they were descending with ropes out of helicopters and just basically jumping out of helicopters. So they took us up in a tower, and I'm thinking it was 100 foot. It might have been 75 foot, but it feels like 100, and you look down and you're going to break your neck if you fall. And they gave us a little bit of training, and I don't remember more than about 10 minutes of training. And they said, grab the rope this way, wind it around your body, and walk down, or basically you jump over the side with your feet bouncing against the tower, and you descend slowly with this rope. And it worked pretty well. Luckily, I followed the instructions, and I got to the bottom. A couple of people chickened out, and it was. I'm sure it was embarrassing. I think it's worth saying that there's a tremendous amount of peer pressure in any organization, in the Army, in any group, and I'm sure I was aware of that. I mean, I was not going to be the one to turn around. So I did it, even though it felt like I was kind of jumping off a cliff, which more or less I was not going to be the one to chicken out.
How about the food while you were there?
You know, it's strange because I'm sort of a foodie now. I like to cook, I like to eat, but I don't remember much of any of the food. I remember being thrilled to get a really good breakfast for $1 in the officers' mess at Fort Bliss. I kind of liked what they call SOS, shit on a shingle. I kind of liked it. And you could have that for breakfast. But I don't remember any of the other food. And we actually ate together at Camp Eagle. Colonel Abood would come in, and he would have a drink, and then he would go into the dining room, and we'd all follow him. And when he sat down, we sat down, and they would have dinner for us. I don't remember one meal, but I do remember just a few days after I got there to Camp Eagle, somebody said, "Oh, we're having a barbecue today." So we went over, and there was this barbecue that was made out of half of a oil drum, and they were barbecuing steaks, and I said, "Well, where did these come? Where did these come from? When's this going to happen again?" And they said, "Oh, we were lucky. These fell off a helicopter." And it took me about a year to realize that they hadn't really fallen off of a helicopter. I mean, I saw them falling out of the door of a helicopter as it took off, but we know that they were purloined someplace. But they were really good ribeyes. I remember that meal very much.
How about sea rations?
Sea rations, we had sea rations primarily as a backup, and part of our operation there was if people got stuck going from point A to point B and were waiting for transportation even to Da Nang or Saigon and were stuck, we would house them and we would have sea rations for them to eat because we might get stuck because of weather or whatever. There might be a lot of people that needed to be fed on short notice. So there were sea rations. I don't remember eating a full meal of sea rations, but I do remember there were odd bits of C rations that had been left over from other people's use of those meals. So I remember eating some C rations and having to open, there were these tiny little tins of peanut butter that were just delicious. Some people didn't like peanut butter, but I did. But these were, the size of a tuna fish can almost, or a can of deviled ham, but thinner, just thinner than a can of sardines, just the thinnest little tin can. And you could open them very carefully with your field can opener and scoop out this really thick peanut butter. So I remember that. I think I still have one of those little can openers, PT39 or something, whatever they call them. I think I still have one of those. I used to carry it around in my pocket.
What'd you do when you had time off?
I don't remember much time off. I remember getting R&R when I went to Bangkok, but time off at Camp Eagle, there just wasn't much of it. Mostly I slept. I think I read magazines. I had a hometown newspaper that came to me. There was a few movies that came through. There was an outdoor movie theater. I remember a couple of movies, but I just don't remember having much time off. It might have been a 12-hour shift, where between eating and bathing and there just wasn't a lot of time to goof off. I don't remember going anywhere on a regular basis to kill time. I certainly don't. There just wasn't much time off.
Describe one of your 12-hour shifts. What was the day?
Well, my typical 12-hour shift was working in a room. It was actually, you could call it a trailer, but it was probably a large storage container like they have on overseas cargo that had been converted into a room with a lot of telephones and some blackboards, and there was probably, I'd say, eight or 10 people working in there. From different services. We had a liaison from the Air Force. We had, I think we might have had a helicopter pilot in there, and a number of staff and clerks, where we were charting and dispatching about 30 helicopters, and these are Chinooks. These are the big heavy lift helicopters that were lifting ammunition and cargo and PX containers up to the fire bases and supporting those troops that were around that area. And then we had transportation battalions of trucks that were taking supplies up where they had roads. So we were setting priorities for who got what when. And every hour or so there would be a dispute, or somebody was trying to apply pressure on someone, and they would elevate it to me, and I would settle an argument or make a decision on a priority as to who would get what. And I remember some of them were, like, we haven't had a PX container up here for 2 weeks, so it was important. They needed those things. So Camp Eagle might have had, I wish I knew, I should look it up, but it might have had 5,000 people in it. It was big and spread out. And there was a perimeter all the way around it, perimeter of watchtowers and barbed wire and bunkers. And somebody had to man or staff that perimeter 24 hours a day. So the duty of officer of the watch was on a rotating basis, where everybody inside the camp had to do this job. So my turn came around only once, as I recall, while I was there, but I had a sector of of the perimeter of the several bunkers and watchtowers that I had to go out and stay there all night. I was given a Jeep, and I had a very experienced sergeant who I was working with, and we would drive between bunker and bunker all night and just monitor the situation. They were looking through night vision goggles at the perimeter and probably listening devices. Each of these bunkers was full of arms. I'm sure they had mortars and heavy machine guns and maybe more on the roof. And there'd be half a dozen soldiers in each of these bunkers. The first one we stopped at, I could smell the marijuana. So and I don't object to marijuana so much as I knew that they were under the influence and that they were kind of cocky if they were doing this. So they had attitude, and they weren't fully aware of what was, they weren't totally with feet on the ground, so to speak. So it just made, the whole thing made me nervous to know that these were the people that I was working with that night, and these were the people that were protecting our perimeter. But this was 1971. It was late in the war. I wasn't naive. The movie MASH was already out. I had actually seen the movie MASH at Fort Bliss with my other classmates down there. Pentagon Papers were coming out. I had seen a copy of that little book. So all this backstory was coming out. People were sort of demoralized. I'd say the attitude was, I want to do the minimum, keep my head down, and get out of here alive. So I guess that brings up the story of this. Well, let me tell the rest of the story of the night watch. So I was a little on edge and a little concerned about who was working with me that night. Everything went well until there was a certain point where someone called and said, we think we see somebody out there trying to sneak in. Basically, we think we see somebody on the perimeter. And they weren't certain about it, and I wasn't certain about it. We looked out there, and we weren't sure if we saw motion or not. But to be cautious, there was a helicopter gunship available, and I called it, and they came in and bombed the hell out of that area. Still don't know if there was anybody out there or not, but they weren't alive after that. That was a pretty impressive display of firepower. They dropped flares and just peppered the area. So it might have been a waste or unnecessary, but the thing was, you just weren't sure. And it just made us a little nervous, and it was available, so we did it. So that and the rocket attack were probably the most dangerous things I did. The rocket attack was a few weeks after I got to Camp Eagle. These sirens went off, and somebody said, "Come on, Lieutenant Copenhagen, we got to jump into the bomb shelter." So the bomb shelter was a piece of culvert that had been half buried in the ground with sandbags over it, and sandbags near the door. And we sat in there for about half an hour, and we could hear the rockets coming in. These are rockets, they're like Scuds. They're used in the Middle East. They're not really aimed. They're kind of aimed like a bottle rocket or a Roman candle is aimed. They're not accurate. They just kind of go in and make a noise, and you don't know what they're going to hit. So we heard the explosions, and then after a while we got out, and that was over. That only happened once that I recall. There was another small incident where, I guess it was when I went into Way. There was some reason I went into Way in this, basically, it was a big trailer that was for hauling people. It was like a bus, but it was actually a fifth wheel. It was a trailer on the back of a truck, as a fifth wheel, but it had seats in it for hauling troops, and we were going in to weigh on this, and I mean, this is actually kind of funny in a way, because they had just oiled the road, and they had oiled the road with something called pentaprime. And I don't know what pentaprime is, but it's somewhere between crankcase oil and asphalt. And this trailer bus got out there and started swerving around, and it's like black ice. So it got to a point where it was unmanageable. We were basically stuck in the road, and we felt like sitting ducks. So we got out, put up a perimeter around the bus, and at a certain point, I think some other vehicle came in and towed us out of there. But it was just stupid that they should not have been using that kind of material. I think it was defective. I think it was basically I think there was some kind of scandal. I mean, this material should not have been used on roads, period. And we should not have been on that road within 24 hours of it having been oiled that way. So it was a situation that shouldn't have happened, but it did, and we felt like sitting ducks, and nothing actually happened to us. We eventually got into way where I saw the Citadel. The Citadel was a Marine camp at one time, and there wasn't much of it left, but you could see some of the buildings. But that was a little hairy. We were kind of wondering, because we were outside the perimeter. We're out in the middle on the road, halfway between the camp and way. Well, I think I'll backtrack a little bit and just mention that one event that happened while I was in Vietnam was a big storm. It was Typhoon Hester in October of '71. And apparently it was a big one. It was, biggest one they'd had in decades. But I remember one of my jobs, actually as soon as I got there, they said, well, in your spare time, look at this book, and they gave me this big 3-ring binder, and it was a contingency plan for what to do or what needed to be done if there was a big storm. So I'd already looked at this book and kind of updated it with information, and it was full of things like they'd drive two of our trucks to each helicopter and tie down the helicopters so they wouldn't blow away, things like that. Well, this we did all that, and then the storm came, and I just remember, that there wasn't much to do at that point except lay low, and I remember being in bed, and the rain was still blowing in on my bed, even though I was in one of these hooches. It was a wood rectangular shed with a tin roof, and there was screen on the side. There were no windows, but there was louvers, so the rain had to be going horizontal in order to get in, and that's what was happening. So I had to put a poncho over myself in bed inside this little hooch cabin. It was just wild. It was wild. So that was over in a couple of days, maybe one day, and then there was the aftermath. I remember flying in a helicopter looking for damage. You could see a lot of damage over the river, and the river there, it was called the Perfume River, and I don't know for sure if that was the name of the river or if that was a joke, but it was called the Perfume River, and you could see it was flooded, and the whole area there, all the flat area of that river delta was flooded. But we were looking for a large barge, because at that point, and that was in October of '71, they were actually deactivating and shipping equipment home. They had deactivated the 10th MEC, the 10th Mechanized Infantry Division. A lot of people, a lot of equipment. They had loaded that equipment on a barge, and it had already started out when the typhoon came. So we were looking for it, because apparently it had broken from its tug, and we found it. It was stranded up on a sandbar. So we found it, and all the equipment was there. But that was an event, going through the Typhoon Hester.
Ed, do you have anything? Have you kept in contact with any of the men you served with?
I have kept in contact with 3 of those I served with. They're all from the Fort Bliss Officers Basic Class. Barry George, Joe Scott, and Justin Mullenix. So Justin is from Oklahoma, Barry's from Michigan, and Joe's from New Jersey. They're all different people. I think Justin got into insurance. Barry's became a lawyer. I'm not sure what Joe's doing. But I'm glad I kept, in fact, I'm glad I did keep in touch with those that I did, because it's been, it's been worthwhile, and it's satisfying to be able to share a few things.
What do you take away as being, well, what was your takeaway from being in the service?
That being in the service was a big confidence builder. I think I left the service with a lot of confidence. So it was confidence that I could take care of myself, and it was confidence that I could make good decisions. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't have to go in. When I was traveling in that so-called gap year between college and actually going active duty, I was exposed to a lot of people and a lot of opportunities. I could have just stayed out there. I could have done something else, but I made a choice. So I think it gave me a confidence in my ability to make good choices.
Do you have any regrets about the time you spent?
I really don't. I think, it might have been heroic to be an anti-war protester or something, but that wasn't me. I don't have any regrets. In fact, I have a couple of things I'm proud of, that I'm glad I made choices. There was a certain point at Camp Eagle where, I forget the circumstances, but there were these new helicopters. Most of the helicopters were Hueys. They're kind of, looks like a big fat bug that carries a lot of troops, carries about a dozen troops. But there were also these new helicopters called Cobras. They were gunships, and they were narrow, because there was really only 2 people. There was a gunner and a pilot. And one of the pilots asked me if I wanted to go up as gunner someday. In fact, like in an hour. Basically I had time off, and he says, if you want to go with me, you can be the gunner. And I'm happy that I did not. There was no reason for me to do that.
What did you learn while you were in there that you take with you now?
I think the sort of things I learned, one thing that I learned was, and I remember almost the instant I learned it, was it's a big world. I remember as I'm leaving California at Traverse Air Force Base in June of '70, I'm in this airplane, this jet, and we're out there taxiing on the runway, about to take off. And we passed so many big aircraft. It was just, I couldn't have counted them. It might have been dozens, it might have been 100, but basically the Air Force is huge. And I'd never seen that many aircraft, military aircraft in one place. So I mean, it just kind of jolted me as like, oh, this is a big operation. And another thing in terms of scale that sort of was awesome is I bought this little radio in Vietnam at the PX, and I was real happy with it. It was because it copied cassettes, it had FM, AM, and I would listen to it. And at night, it would get in all this, you could call it gibberish, but what it was some Asian tongue talking, and I couldn't tell you right now if it was AM or FM, but I couldn't understand a word of it. But what impressed me was that as I scanned through the stations, there were a lot of them. I mean, there were dozens of these stations or these communications going on out there that I had no idea what to think of what they were saying. They might have been talking about me. I don't know if these are little two-way radios that I was intercepting or if it was some radio station in Bangkok. I don't know. But there was a lot of them. There was a lot of people out there, a lot of traffic out there. The world was a lot bigger than I was. So I think that's one of the things I learned. I think I also kind of learned how to keep a low profile. That I don't mean how to avoid things so much as there's no need to stick your neck out unnecessarily. And still, I mean, walking around town, I know how to stay out of sight. I can, how to not daylight yourself, how to walk near the brush, how to walk near buildings, how to walk in a way that you won't be easily seen. It's just kind of instinctual now. So I think I learned how to avoid problems, so to speak, both physically and mentally.
Talk to me about when you came back to the States.
Well, when I came back, I remember flying. We stopped in Japan. Well, just leaving Vietnam was kind of interesting because one thing they said is that you can't take anything with you, and basically you can only take your personal possessions, and very little of that. And I had a raincoat, an Army raincoat, that they would not let me take home, and I was just really surprised, and it irritated me. So I had to throw away my raincoat and leave it for somebody else to find, and got on that plane, and we landed in Japan, refueled, I guess, and then landed in McCord. McCord is the big Air Force base near Tacoma, and I was ready to be discharged. I mean, I had my orders to be discharged, and they were about to discharge me, and actually, this might be a good time to hold this up because this is my DD-214, and this Lieutenant Kirby, a lady lieutenant, assistant adjutant, it says, she pointed out that I was like 4 days short of the time I needed in order to get my full veterans benefits. So thankfully, they noticed that, and they kept me there, just working a kind of a stupid office job for 4 extra days, so that I would qualify for the full veterans benefits. And then I flew home to Fullerton, see my family, and I basically tried to forget about it. And I think it was in about 1981, so this would have been about 10 years later, I joined a parade in downtown Los Angeles. And I think that's the first time I identified as being a veteran. And then I remember in about 1990 was the first time anybody thanked me. And I remember that. When I got out, I thought, oh, you know, with veteran benefit, I'll be able to get a job with the U.S. Forest Service, but it wasn't happening that year. So you know, it's a roster and it's a point system, and there was just a lot of people with veterans points, so I wasn't high enough on the civil service list. So I went back to school. I went back to forestry school at Humboldt State up near Eureka. And then after 2 years there, I had a master's degree, so I had enough points at that point to be very competitive, and I got picked up for a Forest Service job in Idaho, near Orofino, Idaho. And that's where it all started in the summer of '74. So I worked there. I worked on national forests around the West. I got married in Wenatchee, Washington. So I had a good career. I worked for the Forest Service as a watershed specialist, hydrologist, and had a good career in the West. I was in Alaska for a few years. I was in Washington, D.C. for a few years. I was working in Washington, D.C. during 9/11, and we had to evacuate the building because we thought we might be next. We were pretty close to the White House. So then I worked for the Forest Service for 35 years and retired in 2008.
I'm always curious to know, how do you feel the military changed you as a person? Now you kind of referred to that a little before, but kind of focus on it in that context for me.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it did change me. A lot of that change may have happened in ROTC just because those were young. I was young then and impressionable. I think overall, I don't think it was totally by choice that I went into the Army. I wish it hadn't been needed, but I'm glad I didn't avoid it. One thing that I learned early was that I had a command voice, was that I could lead people with my voice. So I don't think I knew that until I was like 19 years old. And maybe I didn't have a good voice then, before that. But I learned, you know, how to make voice commands and how to make people listen to me. And I've used that a lot. I think, you know, other things that I've learned, other than general confidence, I'm really interested in geopolitics, in world affairs, and I don't have any school training in that, other than I know where countries are and I know what's going on in those countries to a pretty high degree, just from reading the newspaper and listening to things, and have opinions about it. So in a sense, I've become pretty worldly, and I have a lot of opinions about military and defense, and I feel I have a right to have it.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you giving us this time and sharing your story with us. You had quite an experience there, and we really appreciate your service. Thank you.
Thank you.